I never thought much about the way my stepfather looked at me, at least, not until recently. 4 years, he was just my mom's husband, a presence in our house that never felt fully mine, but never entirely distant either. A man who was steady, reliable, always calm in ways my mother wasn't. He was the type of person who never raised his voice, who moved through life with quiet confidence, making people feel safe without even trying. Mom, on the other hand, was a whirlwind, constantly grading papers, talking on the phone, too busy to notice when the world shifted around her. She loved us, I knew that, but her life was consumed by her students, by lesson plans, by the never-ending piles of homework she had to correct. That left the two of us, me and my stepfather, alone in the quiet spaces she didn't have time to fill. Maybe that's why I started to notice the changes in him. At first, they were subtle. A hesitation in his voice when he said my name. The way his gaze would linger a second longer than necessary, as if searching for something in my face that even I didn't understand. He had always been kind, but there was something else now, something harder to name. I first felt it one evening when I came downstairs for a glass of water. Mom had fallen asleep on the couch, her glasses still perched on her nose, an open workbook resting on her lap. The house was dimly lit, the air still with the kind of hush that came when everyone else was asleep. I thought I was alone until I stepped into the kitchen and saw him sitting at the table, a glass of red wine in his hand. "You're up late," he said. I shrugged, moving toward the sink. Couldn't sleep. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could feel his gaze on me as I filled my glass, the weight of it settling somewhere deep in my chest. I turned around slowly, resting my back against the counter. "What about you?" I asked. He exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Long day at the hospital." He was a cardiologist, used to making impossible decisions, carrying the weight of people's lives in his hands. But he had never looked burdened by it before. Not like this. I studied him for a moment, the soft creases at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw tensed as he stared down at his drink. I had always thought of him as distant, composed, a man who existed on the edges of my world rather than within it. But in that moment, something about him felt different. He looked at me then, and it was the first time I saw it, the shift. It was in his expression, in the way his fingers tightened around the glass, in the way his eyes darkened just slightly as they met mine. It was small, almost imperceptible. But I felt it, and I knew he did too. I felt it before I understood what was happening. A strange tightness bloomed in my chest, subtle at first, just a small discomfort, like a heavy weight pressing down. I shifted against the counter, assuming it was nothing, maybe just the way I was standing. But then the pressure deepened, spreading outward like invisible hands squeezing my ribs. Something was wrong. My stepfather was still watching me, his eyes shadowed by something unreadable, but as soon as I winced, the shift in his expression was immediate. His gaze sharpened, his entire body going still. I tried to push through it, to take a deep breath and shake it off, but the air seemed too thick, my lungs unable to expand fully. My vision blurred for half a second, dark spots creeping in at the edges. I gripped the counter. I don't feel right," I whispered. Before I could process what was happening, my legs gave out. My body folded forward, the world tilting beneath me, and suddenly I was falling. I barely registered the rush of movement before his hands caught me. Strong, steady hands that had held 1,000 hearts before mine. Hey, stay with me!" His voice cut through the haze, firm but gentle, controlled despite the obvious urgency. He lowered me carefully to the cool tile floor, his hand cradling the back of my head as he eased me down. My chest clenched tighter, pain radiating outward like wildfire. I gasped, fingers curling into his shirt as I struggled to breathe. His face hovered above mine, concern etched into every line. "Look at me," he ordered, his doctor's voice taking over. "Tell me exactly what you're feeling." My voice was barely there, just a whisper between labored breaths. My chest. It hurts. I can't. Okay, he murmured, his hands already moving with practiced precision. He pressed 2 fingers to my neck, his brow furrowing as he counted my pulse. Too fast. Try to stay calm, he instructed, even as his own breathing grew sharper. His hands moved down, pressing lightly over my ribcage. He was feeling for something. I knew that much, but my head was spinning too hard to focus. Does the pain move anywhere? He asked. Your left arm? Your jaw? I nodded weakly. Arm a little. His jaw tensed. You're having a cardiac episode, he said, his voice tight but controlled. Your pulse is irregular. A cardiac episode. The words barely made sense, as though they belonged to someone else entirely. I was 18, healthy, with no reason for my heart to suddenly fail me. And yet, here I was, barely clinging to consciousness as my stepfather, held me like I was something fragile. I need to listen to your heart, he said, already reaching for the stethoscope that he carried in his work bag near the dining table. He moved quickly, rolling me slightly so he could slide his arm under my back, lifting me just enough to position the stethoscope against my skin. The cold metal made me shiver. Or maybe that was just the fear settling in. His eyes narrowed as he listened, his face unreadable. But I could see the calculation in his mind, the rapid assessment of every possibility. You need to breathe slower, he told me. Try to match my breathing. I tried. I really did. But my body wasn't listening. A soft curse slipped from his lips as he dropped the stethoscope. Without hesitation, he reached down, pressing his palm firmly against the center of my chest. Not forceful, not painful, just grounding. Look at me, he said again, but this time, his voice was softer. I blinked up at him, my lashes wet with something I hadn't even realized had spilled over. You're okay, he assured me. I won't let anything happen to you. And somehow, despite the panic twisting inside me, I believed him. His thumb brushed against my temple in a gesture so small, so fleeting, that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But the look in his eyes said otherwise. He wasn't just looking at me as a doctor. He was looking at me as something else. Something neither of us had words for. Something we weren't supposed to acknowledge. My pulse throbbed against his fingertips. My chest ached. And yet, in that moment, I couldn't tell if my heart was racing from fear, or from something far more dangerous. His hand was still pressed gently against my chest, grounding me, stabilizing me, as if he could will my heartbeat into a steady rhythm with just his touch. I could still feel the ghost of his thumb against my temple, a small, fleeting gesture that lingered in my thoughts even as my body struggled to obey his commands. You're okay, he said again, and though I knew he meant it in a medical sense, there was something else behind his voice, something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. I tried to nod, but my body was too weak. The pressure in my chest was easing, but the exhaustion left in its wake was almost worse. I felt like I had just run miles without stopping, my limbs heavy, my breath shallow. Then, before I could fully process what was happening, he moved. His arms came around me in a firm, careful embrace. One of his hands cradled the back of my head, his fingers threading gently through my hair, while the other wrapped around my shoulders, pulling me against the warmth of his chest. It was the first time he had ever hugged me like this. I should have questioned it. I should have thought about what it meant, why it felt so different from any other time he had offered comfort. But I didn't. I just let myself sink into him, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath against my cheek, the warmth of his body seeping into my chilled skin. He smelled faintly of cologne and something sterile, something clean, like the hospital halls he walked every day. I love you, he murmured against my hair, his voice barely above a whisper. A different kind of shiver rolled through me, one that had nothing to do with the fading remnants of my episode. I told myself, He meant it in the way a parent might say it to a child. After all, he had raised me in a way. He had been part of my life for years, ever since he and my mother got married. He had been the one to pick me up from school when she was too busy, the one who made sure I ate dinner, the one who checked on me when I stayed up too late studying. He was just being caring. That's what I told myself. But as he tightened his arms around me, holding me as if I was something fragile, something that might slip away if he let go too soon, I couldn't ignore the way it felt. Different. Too long. Too intentional. The sound of his heartbeat was steady beneath my ear, a strong, rhythmic thump that contrasted the erratic, uneven pounding of my own. "Just breathe," he said softly, his hand still stroking through my hair. "I've got you." I closed my eyes for a moment, focusing only on the sensation of being held. It was overwhelming. It was safe. It was dangerous. Minutes passed, maybe more. He didn't move, and neither did I. It wasn't until I finally felt the pressure in my chest ease, the dizziness retreating, that he finally shifted. He pulled back, just enough to look at me, his brow furrowed in concern. "How do you feel?" "Better," I whispered, my throat dry, my body weak. His fingers brushed against my cheek, warm and steady. "You need water." I barely had time to nod before he was moving. He reached for the glass of water he had poured earlier for himself, bringing it to my lips carefully. "Small sips," he instructed. "Don't rush it." I obeyed, letting the cool liquid soothe my dry throat, but the entire time, his eyes never left my face. It was the way a doctor might look at a patient, but also not. There was something else in his gaze, something deeper, something he wasn't saying. When I had drunk enough, he set the glass aside and exhaled, running a hand down his face. "That scared me," he admitted. "You scared me." I blinked, surprised by his words. "You see people have heart attacks all the time," I murmured. "That's different." His voice was rough, almost frustrated. "They're my patients. They're not you." There was that shift again, that line neither of us had spoken aloud, but both of us had felt. He sighed, leaning back slightly, but he didn't move far. He was still next to me, close enough that I could feel his warmth. "I'm staying here until you feel completely better," he said firmly. "You don't have to." "I want to." The words were soft, but there was no room for argument. And so he stayed. We sat there on the cool tile of the kitchen floor, the house quiet around us. The only sound was the slow, steady rhythm of our breathing, his deep and controlled, mine still slightly uneven but calming. At some point, my body slumped slightly, exhaustion pulling at my limbs. I wasn't asleep, not quite, but I was drifting, my head resting lightly against his shoulder. He didn't move away. Instead, I felt the slow, deliberate motion of his fingers brushing against my arm, the same way he had stroked my hair before. It was soothing. It was careful. It was something else. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us acknowledged what had changed between us in that moment. But we both felt it. We both knew. And nothing would ever be the same again. The air in the kitchen was thick with something neither of us spoke about, something that hung between us in the quiet space of the dimly lit room. My body still felt weak, my limbs heavy from the lingering effects of the episode, but my mind was sharper than ever. I was aware of everything. The warmth of his presence beside me, the way his breathing had slowed, but not quite returned to normal, the way his fingers had traced small, thoughtless circles against my arm before he caught himself and stopped. He was still sitting close, too close, his body angled toward me as if he was reluctant to put any distance between us. His gaze held something I didn't recognize, something unreadable yet intense, something I wasn't sure I was supposed to see. I swallowed hard, my throat still dry despite the water. And then, before I could think about it, before I could question or analyze or remind myself of all the reasons this was not normal, I moved. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the way he had looked at me, like I was something delicate, something he wasn't sure how to hold without breaking. Maybe it was the way his hands had steadied me, the way his voice had wrapped around me like a lifeline when I thought my body was betraying me. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long, waiting for a moment like this to rise. Either way, I moved, and he didn't stop me. My hand lifted first, hesitant, barely brushing against the fabric of his shirt where it stretched over his forearm. His breath hitched, a small, barely audible sound, but I heard it. His eyes darkened, his muscles tensed beneath my fingertips. I wasn't sure who moved next. Maybe both of us. Maybe neither of us. But suddenly, the space between us was gone. Our breaths mingled, warm and uneven. His fingers ghosted over my wrist, hesitant, as if waiting for a sign, some indication that this wasn't a mistake, that this was real. I gave him that sign. I tilted my chin up just enough. And then, slowly, carefully, as if the world would shatter around us, we kissed. It was soft at first, barely there, a question rather than an answer. But then he made a sound, something low in his throat, and suddenly, his hands were on my face, warm and steady, pulling me closer like he had been holding back for far too long. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. I forgot everything. The exhaustion, the fear, the fact that this was something neither of us should have allowed to happen. There was only him, his warmth, his touch, the way he exhaled against my lips like he had just given in to something he couldn't fight anymore. It lasted only a second, maybe two, but it felt like a lifetime. When we pulled away, the world snapped back into focus. I could hear the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of the clock ticking, the distant rustling of trees outside the window, and my own heartbeat, slower now, steady, his forehead pressed lightly against mine, his hands still cradling my face like I might disappear if he let go. His breathing was uneven, but his gaze was steady. "You need to eat something," he said after a long moment, his voice rough, affected. I blinked, still caught in the moment. "What?" "Your glucose levels." He swallowed hard, as if trying to regain control of himself. "You need sugar. Something sweet." I barely had time to process what he was saying before he stood, moving toward the cabinets with an urgency that felt almost desperate, like he needed to do something, anything, to pull himself back from whatever had just happened between us. I watched as he grabbed a jar of Nutella from the top shelf, his fingers gripping it a little too tightly. Then, without a word, he reached for a box of cookies, setting both down on the table in front of me. His movements were precise, clinical, except they weren't. Not really, because when he unscrewed the lid of the Nutella and dipped the knife inside, he hesitated for half a second. And when he turned back to me, something flickered in his expression, something undeniable. "Here," he murmured, spreading a thick layer of chocolate onto one of the cookies before holding it out to me. I stared at him. "You need it," he said, softer this time. There was a weight to his voice, a quiet insistence. And so, I took the cookie from his fingers, my own brushing against his for just a second too long. I took a bite, the taste of hazelnut and cocoa melting on my tongue. His gaze didn't leave my lips. I swallowed. The moment stretched. Something had changed between us. Something we couldn't take back. And neither of us knew what to do about it.